The annual Halsted Masquerade Ball, Mayfair, London, 1814. Miss Charlotte Halsted had grown to prefer observation to participation at these social events. It wasn't shyness, precisely. Or rather, it was shyness, but not in the way most people assumed. Charlotte was perfectly comfortable with who she was. The youngest Halsted, naturally reserved, content to watch the social dance from the sidelines rather than throw herself into its center. Her family was respected, her position secure. She simply had no desire to compete for attention she didn't particularly want. Tonight, at her family's annual masquerade, Charlotte, elegant and graceful in a cream silk gown, with delicate gold details at the bodice, stood near the refreshment table, her blonde hair extravagantly woven with gold ribbons and pearls to match the gold of her mask. She fondly watched her brothers navigate the crush of admirers with their usual contrasting styles. The Halsted brothers whispered about in anticipation of the masquerade. Society's debutantes were all a-twitter at the prospect of catching their eye. Sebastian, the eldest, the heir to their father's viscountcy, held court near the terrace doors, even masked, his dark hair, light green eyes, and bearing commanded attention. The responsible eldest son, proper and distinguished. 3 mammas hovered nearby with their daughters, all vying for a moment of his notice. Gabriel, only 2 years Charlotte's senior, danced with practiced ease with Miss Thornbury, while half a dozen young ladies watched with poorly concealed envy. Where Sebastian was commanding, Gabriel was charm personified. Some thought he looked like a dangerous gentleman, which made Charlotte almost giggle out loud when she heard such outlandish descriptions. Lady Pembroke had described him as sensational, and watching him now, Charlotte couldn't disagree. He played to his audience with natural ease, clearly enjoying every moment. Charlotte smiled behind her intricately detailed golden mask. Her brothers were thoroughly occupied, which meant no one would disturb her excellent vantage point. She loved her brothers dearly, Sebastian's protective nature, Gabriel's easy affection, and evenings like this, when they were overwhelmed by attention, gave her a delightful freedom to observe without interference. The gown was unique, and her hair was woven and arranged so carefully that she felt like a completely different person, but it was her mask that made it especially so. It was a 3/4 mask that covered half of her face completely, and the other half partially, and it was made with the most delicate gold filigree. Her china blue eyes, normally a lighter bluer hue than Sebastian's blue-green, looked unusually dark behind her mask, and she appeared far more sophisticated than she actually was. She soon realized only her closest friends and family knew it was her. The Halsted brothers, Lady Pembroke's voice carried from a nearby cluster of matrons, are certainly considered the prizes of the season. Lord Sebastian, so distinguished, and young Mr. Gabriel, well, just look at the ladies vying for the gentleman's eye. Her tone carried the weight of pronouncement rather than gossip, and several mammas nodded in fervent agreement. Charlotte resisted smiling. The Halsted family was widely respected, the viscountcy ancient and honourable, their reputation sterling. Her brother's popularity was hardly surprising, even if it did make gatherings like this somewhat exhausting for them. "Charlotte, dear." Her mother materialized beside her, resplendent in ruby silk. "Why are you standing by the refreshments? You should be dancing. We are young into the season. Tonight is an evening for enjoyment." "I'm quite content here, Mamma, but I will consider your words most assuredly." Her mother's expression shifted to gentle exasperation, a look Charlotte knew well. Content to observe as always. Darling, you're 22. At some point, you'll need to do more than watch. When someone interesting asks, I'll consider it. Interesting, her mother repeated with a sigh. Your standards are impossibly high. Perhaps, or perhaps I'm simply selective. Charlotte kept her voice light. Would you prefer I accept every invitation from gentlemen I find tedious? I'd prefer you accept some invitations. Lord Ashford was quite taken with you at the Pemberton ball. Lord Ashford is nearly 40, Mama. And a perfect gentleman. Your brother approved. Until he decided Lord Ashford was too old after all. Charlotte couldn't quite keep the edge from her voice. Sebastian finds fault with everyone. Her mother's expression softened, and she patted her hand. He only wants the best for you. I know. And Charlotte did know. Sebastian's protectiveness came from love, even when it was frustrating. But his standards seemed designed to ensure no one is ever good enough. Before her mother could respond, Lady Pemberton swept past, and her mother excused herself with a promise they'd continue this conversation later. Charlotte returned her attention to the ballroom, content to resume her observations. That contentment lasted approximately 3 more minutes. Lady Catherine Winters stood near the terrace doors, speaking with a gentleman Charlotte didn't immediately recognize. Lady Catherine was the eldest daughter of the Earl of Pemberton, beautiful, ambitious, and at 26, increasingly desperate to secure an advantageous match. Charlotte had always found her calculating in a way that set her teeth on edge. The gentleman with her was striking, tall, elegant in black evening clothes, with dark hair that fell just slightly too long to be entirely proper. His black mask did nothing to diminish the natural confidence in his bearing, the way he seemed to command space without effort. Lady Catherine touched his arm, leaning close. The gentleman smiled politely, but seemed to be declining whatever she'd suggested. Lady Catherine's expression tightened before smoothing back into practiced charm. Charlotte might have thought nothing of it. Failed flirtation was hardly unusual, except that Lady Catherine then moved away and whispered urgently to 2 other women positioned near the musicians' gallery. Something in their purposeful dispersal made Charlotte's stomach tighten with unease. One of Lady Catherine's companions moved to intercept a passing group of ladies, drawing them toward the terrace entrance with animated conversation. The other positioned herself with a clear view of anyone stepping outside. She watched Lady Catherine return to the gentleman just a little later, this time gesturing toward the terrace with apparent casualness. The gentleman glanced outside, then nodded, allowing her to guide him toward the open doors. Charlotte's breath caught as understanding crystallized. A compromise trap. She'd heard of such schemes whispered about in retiring rooms, ambitious women forcing scandals to secure marriages. The pattern was unmistakable. Lure the target outside, create a compromising situation, and ensure witnesses arrived at precisely the right moment. And this was happening at her family's ball. Charlotte glanced toward her brothers. Sebastian remained deep in conversation, surrounded by his usual court of admirers. Gabriel was leading Miss Thornbury through the final steps of their dance, 3 other young ladies already positioning themselves to claim his next set. Neither would notice the trap unfolding near their own terrace. If a scandal erupted here, at the Halsted Masquerade, it would reflect poorly on their family's reputation. Her mother would be mortified. Sebastian would be furious at the breach of hospitality. Charlotte should tell Sebastian. He would handle it with his usual efficiency and authority. But even as she thought it, she saw Lady Catherine guide the gentleman through the terrace doors, saw her reach up as if to adjust her sleeve. No, saw her fingers deliberately catch on the delicate cap sleeve of her emerald gown, tearing the fabric with practiced precision. There was no time to find Sebastian. Charlotte was moving before she could reconsider, her heart hammering as she crossed the ballroom floor. She'd never inserted herself into notice like this, never acted without consulting Sebastian first. But her feet carried her forward on a wave of responsibility. And something else. Something that felt like the courage she'd always possessed, but rarely had reason to use. She reached the terrace just as Lady Catherine disappeared into the shadows, positioning herself artfully, one sleeve torn, her posture suggesting distress. The gentleman stood a few feet away, clearly confused, his hand half extended, as if he'd been about to offer assistance. The witness ladies were already turning, already moving toward the terrace with predatory precision. "There you are." Charlotte's voice rang out clear and warm, as if she'd been searching for this stranger all evening. She swept onto the terrace with practiced grace, her smile bright and guileless. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The gentleman turned and Charlotte's breath caught. Even with the mask, his eyes were remarkable, a deep blue that seemed to see straight through her careful composure. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin warm, confusion and curiosity flickering across his features. Lady Catherine's carefully arranged distress shifted to sharp alertness. "We were just—" Charlotte deftly ignored her, as if nothing was awry, looking only at the gentleman, and tugging him subtly backward and further away from Lady Catherine. "Lord Hartwell and the Duchess were asking for you," Charlotte continued, addressing the gentleman as if Lady Catherine hadn't spoken, and didn't even exist. Her heart raced, but she kept her smile steady, her voice confident. "In the blue drawing room. They said it was rather urgent." Complete fabrication. There was no Lord Hartwell at this gathering, no Duchess waiting anywhere. But Charlotte delivered the lie with enough conviction that she saw understanding flash in those remarkable blue eyes. He was intelligent then, quick enough to recognize and appreciate the rescue. "Ah, yes, of course." He inclined his head to Lady Catherine with impeccable courtesy, his expression suggesting nothing amiss. "You'll excuse me, Lady Winters. I do hope you're able to mend your gown." His tone was perfectly polite, but Charlotte caught the faint emphasis on mend that suggested he understood exactly what he'd interrupted. Lady Catherine's smile froze into something brittle and sharp. The witness ladies had reached the terrace entrance, their expressions shifting from anticipation to confusion at finding the scene so publicly innocent. "Surely it can wait," Lady Catherine began almost desperately. "I'm afraid not." The gentleman turned smoothly back to Charlotte, increasing the distance between him and the other lady, and something in his expression made her pulse skip. Warmth, perhaps, or recognition of what she'd just done. "Shall we?" He offered his arm. Charlotte stared at it for a heartbeat. She'd never walked arm in arm with a gentleman like this, as if she belonged at his side. But the mask gave her permission to be bold, or perhaps it was simply that she had already committed to the rescue and needed to see it through. She placed her hand on his sleeve. The warmth of him radiated through the fine fabric of his coat, solid and real beneath her fingers. He was tall enough that she had to walk closer to his side than she'd anticipated, close enough to catch the faint scent of bergamot and something else slightly muskier, something that made her intensely aware of every point of contact between them. They moved through the ballroom together, and Charlotte felt the weight of curious eyes following their progress. Her mother would have questions. Sebastian might actually notice. But in this moment, with her hand on this stranger's arm and her heart racing beneath her ribs, Charlotte felt strangely, impossibly alive. She guided him toward the corridor that led toward the library, away from prying eyes and Lady Catherine's schemes. Neither of them spoke until they'd left the ballroom's noise behind. The gentleman stopped, turning to face her fully. In the quieter space, he seemed even more striking. The sharp line of his jaw, the intelligence in his gaze, the way he looked at her as if she were a puzzle worth solving. There is no Lord Hartwell in the blue drawing room, is there? Charlotte's boldness wavered slightly. Up close, without the ballroom's noise and movement to distract her, she was acutely conscious of how improper this was. Alone in a corridor with a strange gentleman, having just lied to half the ton. But she'd committed to the rescue. She wouldn't falter now. No, she admitted, and no Duchess. He said matter-of-factly. No, she admitted again. I thought not. A slow smile curved his mouth, and Charlotte felt an answering warmth bloom in her chest. It wasn't the practiced, charming smile she'd seen him wear in the ballroom. This one was genuine, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire face. Then it appears, he said softly, that you just saved me from a rather unpleasant situation. Yes, I suppose I did. Why? He asked. The question hung between them, simple and direct. Charlotte considered her answer carefully. Because I couldn't let a scandal happen at my family's ball would reveal too much and defeat the purpose of wearing the mask. Because I couldn't watch them trap you sounded too dramatic, she thought to herself. I happened to notice what Lady Catherine was planning, she said finally. It wouldn't have been right. Not here. Not anywhere. Something shifted in his expression, a softness that made her chest tighten. Most people would have looked away, decided it wasn't their concern. Perhaps I'm not most people, she said quietly. No. The single word carried absolute certainty. You're clearly not. They stood there in the quiet corridor, the sounds of the masquerade muted by distance, and Charlotte felt something shift between them. A connection she'd never experienced before, as if he saw her in a way that had nothing to do with being a Halsted or Sebastian's sister or anyone's daughter. Just her. I should return to the ballroom, she said, though she made no move to leave. Should you? He tilted his head slightly, studying her. Or would you rather stay here a moment longer, away from Lady Catherine's inevitable displeasure? Despite herself, Charlotte smiled. Is she truly displeased? Undoubtedly. You foiled her plans quite thoroughly. His eyes crinkled with humor. I'm devastated, naturally. Such a tragic loss of potential matrimony. The dry sarcasm in his voice startled a laugh from her, a real one, unguarded and genuine. His smile widened in response, and Charlotte felt that strange warmth spread through her chest. You don't seem particularly devastated. A skilled performance, surely. Quite skilled. They were still standing close, she realized. Proper distance would require her to step back, to create the space that society demanded. But something about him made her feel comfortable, as if standing in a darkened corridor with a stranger she'd just rescued was somehow natural. "I should ask your name," he said, his voice dropping lower, "so I know who to thank for my narrow escape." Charlotte's heart fluttered with something that might have been nerves or excitement. A name would connect her to this moment, to him, would make it real rather than a masked adventure. Part of her wanted to tell him, but another part, the part that had learned Sebastian's protective nature too well, hesitated. "Perhaps," she said, allowing a hint of mischief into her voice, "I'm not the sort of person who should be thanked. Perhaps I wasn't even invited to this ball at all. Perhaps you're speaking to someone entirely inappropriate." His eyes sharpened with interest and amusement at her audacity. Then his gaze swept over her with deliberate attention that made Charlotte's breath catch. He studied her gown, the fine silk, the delicate embroidery at the edge of the bodice and hem, the expert tailoring that spoke of Bond Street modistes rather than servants' quarters. His eyes travelled to her hands, noting the softness of skin that had never known manual labour, the elegant way she held herself even in her teasing deflection. When his gaze returned to her face, Charlotte felt heat bloom in her cheeks. She'd never been examined so thoroughly, with such focused attention. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt thrilling, as if he were truly seeing her, cataloguing every detail. "Your gown suggests otherwise," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "That silk is French, if I'm not mistaken. The embroidery alone would cost more than most servants earn in a year." His eyes held hers. "And your bearing, the way you move, the way you speak. You're no interloper or servant, mysterious rescuer. You're exactly where you belong." Charlotte's pulse raced. He'd looked at her, really looked, and seen through her deflection to something true. Not her name, perhaps, but her place in this world. "Perhaps the mystery is better than certainty," she managed. "Maybe," he agreed, though his slight smile suggested he didn't quite believe it. "Though I confess you've made yourself quite memorable, mystery or not." His admiring gaze grew discontented, seeking her eyes beyond the mask, as if impatient to know her better. "Take off your mask," he commanded gently, almost in a whisper. She looked into his eyes that looked back at her with an intensity that made her wonder how she was even surviving it. His voice, at odds with his gaze, had lulled her with its velvet warmth. She felt under a spell and almost lifted her hands to comply before catching herself. He noticed her slight movement and smiled into her eyes. His gaze followed the gold filigree of her elaborate mask, tracing the gold as it blended intricately into the ribbons and pearls in her hair, a feat that had taken her maid well over an hour to accomplish. He reached up and tucked a stray tendril behind the delicate shell of her ear. She shivered. He felt it, and he lost his smile, looking down at her seriously, as if making a decision. Slowly, he leaned forward, and she felt the warmth of his breath next to her ear. "Tell me your name. I need to thank you properly." He whispered, then straightened again, and their eyes locked. The mask that made her so very brave also seemed to dare impropriety. She felt playful, free, as she smiled up at him, taunting him with her silence. Voices drifted from the ballroom, and the moment was gone. She could now hear Sebastian's deeper tone among the voices, along with her mother's calling for someone. "You should return," she said quickly, "before anyone notices your absence and creates speculation." "And you?" he asked. "I'll follow in a moment, separately. It's better that way." He nodded. "Very well. But first—" He caught her hand before she could retreat, and Charlotte's heart stuttered as he raised it to his lips. Even through her glove, she felt the warmth of his mouth, the gentle pressure that sent heat racing up her arm. "Thank you. I'm truly indebted to you. You saved me from more than you know. I shall find you when you return." Then he released her and was gone, returning to the ballroom and leaving Charlotte alone and feeling almost bereft in the corridor with her racing pulse and the lingering sensation of his kiss burning through her glove. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer against her palm. What had she just done? She'd approached a strange gentleman, fabricated an elaborate excuse to extract him from a compromised trap, and stood alone with him, trading observations that felt increasingly personal, and had let him get close enough to almost kiss her. Charlotte Halsted had just participated in the most audacious rescue of her life. And the most extraordinary part was how natural it had felt. How right. She waited several more minutes, letting her heartbeat slow before returning to the ballroom. The masquerade continued in full swing. Gabriel was dancing with another young lady, his natural charm on full display. At the end of the corridor, Sebastian stood with his back to her with a group near the windows, finally free of the mamma and debutante Sage, looking almost relaxed. Neither brother glanced her way, still caught up in their own evening. "My lady," a deep voice behind her halted her escape. "Would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" Charlotte turned slowly, knowing who was behind her. Her heart was still beating as rapidly as her thoughts. This wasn't over yet. The masquerade was still in full force. Surely it was her responsibility as a member of the family to ensure their guests enjoyed themselves. She smiled to herself, and then at him. "The honor is mine," she replied, noticing the dance he referenced was starting up just as he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. If there were ever a place and a time more adequate to dance with a masked stranger, it was now. Charlotte embraced it. She took her place in the set as her masked gentleman formally claimed her hand. They stood in silence, each watching the other with a quiet that was neither awkward nor comfortable. It was the same silence they had shared moments earlier, charged, unfinished, and oddly private despite the crowd pressing in around them. The music began, and they took their places in the set. Charlotte was aware at first of the formality of it, the proper distance, the measured steps, and then of how carefully he observed them. Not as one who meant to lead by force of habit, but as though he were matching himself to her pace. She had expected him to speak. He did not. Instead, he guided her through the figures with quiet attention, his hand steady at her waist, his gaze never wandering. It reminded her, unexpectedly, of the moment in the corridor, the way he had listened before thanking her, as though words were something to be chosen, not spent. "You found me," she said at last. "I said I would," he replied simply. "You wasted no time." She smiled. "I rarely do." He promised. No flourish followed, no charm to soften it. Just the truth, offered without ceremony. They moved together in silence once more, the music drawing them nearer with each turn. When the dance ended and he released her hand, Charlotte felt the loss of it distinctly. Not because she wished him to claim her, but because the space between them had begun to feel deliberate. Charlotte slipped back to her position near the refreshment table, as if she'd never left. The dark-haired gentleman, she still didn't know his name, stood across the room with Lord Ashford, sticking close to the other gentleman now. As Charlotte watched, he turned his head, scanning the crowd. Was he searching for her again? The thought sent a flutter through her chest. Charlotte. Margaret appeared at her elbow with shocking abruptness, gripping Charlotte's arm and pulling her slightly away from the main crowd. Her peacock-feathered mask did nothing to hide the mixture of shock and excitement in her eyes. Tell me everything. Walking through the ballroom, on his arm, dancing with him. Charlotte's stomach dropped. I don't know what. Margaret's eyes were wide. Charlotte. Of all the gentlemen? Don't worry. Sebastian was in the cards room, then talking with a group of friends. He didn't notice a thing. And honestly, very few people would recognize it's you tonight, so all is well. No, we were simply, bless my soul, Lord Blackwood. Margaret's grip tightened. The Earl of Blackwood, the Rake, Charlotte, the one who's broken half the hearts in London, the one your mother warned you about just last week. The Earl of Blackwood, London's most notorious rake. A man whose reputation for charm and scandal was known throughout the ton. And Charlotte had just rescued him, stood alone with him in a corridor, let him kiss her hand through her glove, and danced with him. Oh, she breathed, the word barely audible over the music. Margaret studied her face with growing concern. You didn't know, did you? Charlotte, what were you doing with him? Alone? Talking. Just talking. The words sounded insufficient even to her own ears. Just talking. Margaret's expression shifted from shock to worry. Charlotte, you can't be seen with him like that. Nothing happened. It was perfectly innocent. Was it? Margaret's voice dropped lower. Because the way he was looking at you. Charlotte, that didn't look innocent. That looked like a man who was very interested. Charlotte's pulse raced. You're imagining things. Am I? Margaret glanced across the ballroom to where Lord Blackwood stood. As if sensing their attention, he turned, his gaze finding Charlotte's and holding it for a long moment before Lord Ashford claimed his attention. He's still watching you, Margaret whispered. Charlotte, whatever happened in that corridor, on the dance floor, I assure you nothing happened. Charlotte squeezed her friend's hand. Please, Margaret, don't say anything, especially not to Sebastian. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then sighed. I won't. But Charlotte, men like Lord Blackwood are dangerous precisely because they're charming. I know. But for the rest of the evening, Charlotte was acutely aware of blue eyes finding hers across the crowded ballroom. She couldn't help but think that perhaps one evening of danger, one masked encounter with someone who looked at her differently than what she was used to, was worth whatever consequences might follow. She slipped from the ballroom before the midnight unmasking was scheduled, pleading a headache to her mother. In her room, Charlotte removed the intricate mask with trembling fingers and stared at her reflection. The same face looked back at her, her delicate features, her fine bone structure, her blonde hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. The face her mother said came from their French grandmother, elegant rather than the typical English rose beauty the ton celebrated. She'd always been comfortable with her appearance, with who she was. But tonight, standing with Lord Blackwood in that corridor, she'd felt something more. Not beautiful, though perhaps that too, but noticed, truly seen, in a way that had nothing to do with being a Halsted or her brother's sister. It wasn't the mask that had made her bold, she realized, for in the heat of the moment of the rescue, she'd completely forgotten the masquerade. The mask had simply given her permission to act on the courage she'd always possessed, but rarely had reason to use. And Lord Blackwood, Rake, scoundrel, precisely the sort of man Sebastian would never approve of, had made her feel more genuinely herself than any of the suitable gentlemen her brother had reluctantly allowed near her. That was perhaps the most dangerous realization of all. Tomorrow, she would return to being sensible, quiet, Charlotte Halsted again. But tonight, she'd been brave, and it had felt extraordinary. The morning after the masquerade, Charlotte woke with the memory of blue eyes and a warm voice saying, "You're clearly not most people." She pressed her face into her pillow and smiled despite herself. It had been reckless, perhaps even foolish. But for one evening she'd acted instead of observed, and the thrill of it still hummed through her veins. By afternoon, reality had reasserted itself. Sebastian summoned her to his study. Charlotte, her eldest brother, stood by the window, his usual commanding posture softened slightly by genuine affection. "I wanted to speak with you about last night." Her heart stuttered. Had someone seen her with Lord Blackwood? Had Margaret said something despite her promise? "The masquerade was lovely," she said carefully, taking the chair he indicated. Mother seemed pleased with how it went. She was. Sebastian turned to face her, and Charlotte saw something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "Though I noticed you left early, before the unmasking." "I had a headache," she lied. He quirked a brow, eyeing her questioningly. "Did you dance at all?" Charlotte's fingers tightened slightly on the chair's arms. "Once." Sebastian's expression shifted to that particular combination of frustration and concern she knew too well. "Charlotte, you're 22. You can't simply observe forever." "Why not?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "You've made it abundantly clear that no gentleman meets your standards. Why should I exhaust myself trying when you'll only find fault?" "That's not entirely fair," he started to say, before Charlotte interrupted him. "Isn't it?" Charlotte stood, her composure cracking slightly. Mr. Carrington was too frivolous. Lord Ashford too old. Mr. Pemberton had a gambling problem you discovered only after he'd lost interest. At what point, Sebastian, do I get to make my own choices? Her brother's jaw tightened. "I only want what's best for you." "What's best for me would be the freedom to choose, even if I make mistakes." Charlotte softened her voice slightly. "I know you love me, Sebastian. I know you're trying to protect me, but you're so determined no one is good enough that I've stopped even trying." Sebastian looked stricken. "Charlotte, I never meant—" "I know." And she did. His heart was good, even when his judgment was excessive. "But perhaps you could trust me a little more. Trust that I'm capable of determining who's worth my time." She left before he could respond, her heart pounding. She'd never challenged Sebastian quite so directly before, but standing in that corridor with Lord Blackwood, acting on her own judgment, her own courage, had reminded her that she was capable of more than Sebastian seemed to believe. Over the following weeks, Charlotte attended the usual round of balls and gatherings. She resumed her customary position of observation, content to watch the social machinery turn without throwing herself into its gears. But now she was watching for someone specific. Lord Blackwood was impossible to miss. His height, his dark good looks, the natural confidence that drew eyes wherever he went. But Charlotte noticed something else, something that made her pulse quicken. He was searching, scanning the room, the arrivals. Was he looking for her? For the woman who had saved him? Even if so, it would not matter. She did like watching him regardless. He seemed to be looking at the blonde-haired ladies more closely than the others. The realization sent heat to her face, a blush she tried desperately to suppress. It meant nothing, she told herself. Half the ladies in London had blonde hair. But at the Pemberton garden party, she watched him speak briefly with Miss Hampton, a celebrated blonde beauty, before his gaze drifted past her to continue scanning the crowd. Still searching. At Lady Thornbury's musical, Charlotte stood in her usual corner and watched Lord Blackwood pause mid-conversation to study a light-haired woman across the room. Charlotte recognized her. Miss Weatherby, painfully shy, rarely spoke above a whisper. He approached her, spoke to her with genuine attention, and leaned in to hear her quiet responses. Charlotte felt an unfamiliar twist in her chest that might have been jealousy. But then he moved on, still searching, still unsatisfied. By the third week, Lord Blackwood's frustration had become evident. At the Hartwell soiree, Charlotte watched him stand alone near the terrace for several minutes, his jaw tight, his posture suggesting internal conflict. Part of her wanted to approach him, but every time she considered it, she imagined Sebastian's reaction. Her brother had grudgingly approved several suitors over the years, acceptable men from good families with sterling reputations, and Charlotte had let him chase each one away because none of them had been worth fighting for. But Lord Blackwood, a notorious rake with a scandalous reputation, Sebastian would forbid it absolutely. The Thornbury ball arrived weeks after the Masquerade. Charlotte attended, but took a position near a convenient alcove where she could observe without being observed. She was feeling slightly melancholy today and even less social than usual. The evening proceeded predictably until Charlotte decided she needed air. The ballroom was stifling, the conversation tedious. She slipped out to the garden seeking cool night air and a few moments of genuine solitude. The Thornbury garden was extensive, with winding paths lit by paper lanterns and secluded benches tucked among flowering shrubs. Charlotte followed a familiar route toward a bench beneath a rose arbor, grateful for the quiet. She'd been there perhaps 5 or 10 minutes when footsteps crunched on gravel. Charlotte looked up to find Lord Blackwood rounding a corner. He stopped when he saw her, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something warmer. "Forgive me," he said, his voice carrying that same timbre she remembered from the Masquerade. "I didn't realize anyone was here. I'll leave you to your solitude." "No, The word escaped before Charlotte could stop it. Something about seeing him here, away from the ballroom's performance and pretense, made her brave. "There's no need. The garden is large enough for 2. He hesitated, then moved closer. In the lantern light, he looked tired, lines of tension around his eyes that hadn't been there at the masquerade. "You're very kind." He settled onto the far end of the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. "These affairs can sometimes be rather tedious." "Can they?" Charlotte found herself genuinely curious. "I would have thought someone like you would find them entertaining." "Someone like me?" A hint of wry amusement touched his voice. "What do you imagine I'm like?" Charlotte realized her tactical error too late. She couldn't very well say a notorious Rake without revealing she knew exactly who he was. "I only meant, you seem quite popular, always surrounded by conversation." "Ah, yes, surrounded." Something in his tone suggested that wasn't entirely pleasant. Though, I confess, much of that conversation is remarkably similar from one event to the next. The same observations, the same compliments, the same careful dance of saying nothing meaningful while appearing engaged. The honesty in his admission surprised her. "That sounds dreadfully tedious." "It is?" He turned to look at her more fully, which is why finding someone who speaks plainly is remarkably refreshing. I count myself fortunate whenever I encounter honesty. Charlotte felt heat bloom in her cheeks. "I'm not sure plain speaking is always valued in society." "Perhaps not, but it should be." His gaze held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "There's something extraordinary about genuine honesty in a world built on performance." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the ball muted by distance and greenery. Charlotte found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did with strangers, or rather, with anyone outside her immediate family. "May I ask you something?" he said suddenly. "Of course." "Why do you stand in corners? At every gathering I've attended recently, you're always positioned at the edges, observing others, but only occasionally joining in. Forgive me if I'm being impertinent, but you are by far one of the loveliest young ladies in attendance." Charlotte's breath caught. He'd noticed her, not just tonight, but at multiple events. While she'd been watching him search, he'd been watching her. "I prefer observation," she said carefully. "I tend to be quite shy more often than not, and there's a certain peace in watching without the pressure of being watched in return." "Peace." He repeated the word thoughtfully. "Or protection." The question was too perceptive. Charlotte looked away, studying the roses climbing the arbor. "Perhaps both." "From what?" he asked. "Expectations, judgment, the exhaustion of performing, as you put it." She surprised herself with her honesty. When one observes, one is free to be genuine, to think actual thoughts rather than curating acceptable opinions. "That," he said quietly, "is possibly the most honest thing anyone has said to me in weeks." Charlotte looked back at him, found him studying her with something that looked almost like wonder. "I doubt that." "No, truly." He shifted slightly, angling toward her. "Most people assume that being surrounded by attention is a privilege. They don't consider it might also be a burden, a constant performance with no relief. Like being expected to be bold when one is naturally reserved," Charlotte offered. "Society assumes shyness is a flaw to be overcome, rather than simply a different way of being." His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes. "Exactly. Though I'd argue you're not as shy as you think." "What makes you say that?" "You're speaking quite frankly with me now, a complete stranger in a dark garden. That takes a certain courage. Charlotte's heart fluttered. He was right. She was being bolder than usual, but something about him made it feel natural, as if she could trust him with her genuine thoughts, rather than performing acceptable ones. Perhaps your frankness makes it easier, she suggested. Or perhaps you're simply more courageous than you give yourself credit for. His voice dropped lower, intimate. I think you underestimate yourself, miss. He let the question hang, clearly hoping she'd supply her name. I beg your pardon. We've not been formally introduced. I am Alexander Branham. His voice carried quiet insistence as he watched her, waiting. Charlotte, she said finally. Charlotte Halsted. His eyes widened for the briefest moment. Halsted. Sebastian Halsted's sister. Charlotte's throat tightened. She'd hoped to prolong the moment when he knew her as herself rather than as Sebastian Halsted's sister. She sighed inwardly. We should return to the ballroom, she said softly, before someone notices we're both missing and draws conclusions. He nodded. As you wish. He stood, offering his hand to help her rise. Though I confess, I've enjoyed this conversation more than any I've had inside. Charlotte placed her hand in his, and the warmth of his touch sent familiar heat racing up her arm. The same sensation from the Masquerade when he'd kissed her gloved hand. Did he feel it too? This connection that seemed to spark whenever they were near each other? May I walk you back? He asked, his voice gentler now. Yes, thank you, she replied softly. She placed her hand on his arm, and they walked together through the garden paths. The lanterns cast dancing shadows, the night air sweet with rose and honeysuckle. Charlotte found herself wishing the path were longer, the garden more extensive, anything to prolong these moments of genuine connection. They entered the ballroom together, and Charlotte immediately felt the weight of curious attention. Her mother stood across the room, speaking with Lady Pemberton, but her gaze found Charlotte with unerring accuracy. Her expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm as she registered who escorted her daughter. Charlotte. Her mother approached with practiced speed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. There you are. I've been looking everywhere. She looked pointedly at Lord Blackwood, clearly recognizing him despite weeks having passed since their last encounter. Mrs. Halsted. He bowed with impeccable curtsy. Your daughter and I were merely taking some air. I'm sure. Her mother's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. Charlotte, Sebastian is asking for you something about, well, it's quite urgent. It was a polite fiction, an excuse to separate them. Charlotte felt Lord Blackwood's hand glide briefly over her arm before he released her. Of course. Charlotte turned to him, found his eyes studying her with that same intense focus. Thank you for the escort, Lord Blackwood. The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Halsted. But his gaze seemed to hold questions about things unspoken between them. Her mother guided her away with gentle but firm pressure, steering her toward a quieter alcove. Charlotte. Her mother's voice was low but fierce. What were you thinking? Alone in the garden with him? We were merely talking, Mamma. Alone. After dark. Her mother's eyes were worried. Do you want to end up compromised? Trapped in marriage with a man of his reputation? We were talking. He was a perfect gentleman, Charlotte repeated, though she knew how it looked. Nothing improper occurred. Her mother studied her face with uncomfortable perception. "Charlotte, I know you wouldn't deliberately court scandal, but you must be more careful. Men like Lord Blackwood are dangerous precisely because they're charming. They bring gossip just by being, and they make you forget propriety." Charlotte nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Because her mother was right. She had forgotten everything except how right it felt to sit beside him in the darkness, trading honest observations neither would share in the ballroom's light. That evening, Charlotte resumed her customary corner and watched Lord Blackwood across the room. He stood with Lord Ashford, but his attention kept drifting back to her. Their eyes would meet, hold for long moments, before one or both was forced to look away. He knew who she was now. Charlotte Halsted, Sebastian's youngest sister, the protected, carefully guarded sister of two of London's most eligible bachelors. And instead of polite distance, instead of the careful withdrawal most men employed when they realized exactly who her family was, he looked at her as if she were a mystery he'd begun to solve, as if pieces were falling into place. Margaret appeared at her elbow. "Charlotte, he's staring at you again." "I know," she said calmly. "Do you?" Margaret's voice carried unusual seriousness. "He seems to be quite intrigued." Charlotte's pulse quickened. Could he be connecting her to the masquerade? The woman in the corridor with the fabricated excuse. The woman in the garden who spoke of observation and peace. She looked around the room. There had to be at least 30, maybe 40 other blondes present at this event. She dismissed her earlier thoughts. Even from this distance, she felt the assessment, felt him take in every aspect of her appearance, as if categorizing her features to memory. She watched him watch her. Even from this far away, she knew instinctively that he was pleased with what he saw. She thanked the graces she could not read his mind, as she knew without a shred of doubt she'd be blushing if she had. Just from the way he was looking at her from beneath his lashes, almost trying not to look, and the natural relaxation of his mouth as it curved ever so slowly upward. His eyes slowly raised to hers, and she held his gaze boldly, even while her entire body involuntarily shivered. She held her breath, wondering where her sudden boldness had come from. He nodded toward her, acknowledging her acknowledgement while she waited for his usual telltale, rakish, and ever so charming grin to appear. To her shock, her amazement, it never did. He simply stood watching her, but with no grin. He looked fascinated and perturbed. Yes, she decided as she studied him as directly as he was studying her. That was the correct word. He looked perturbed, disturbed even, as he stood across the ballroom, watching her. He straightened slightly, as if some understanding seemed to crystallize in his mind. Perhaps he suspected, and Charlotte had absolutely no idea what would happen next. But standing in her corner, meeting his gaze across the crowded room, she felt that same thrill she'd experienced at the Masquerade, the courage to act rather than merely observe. The question was, did she dare act again? 3 weeks after the Thornbury ball, Charlotte had become achingly familiar with the weight of Lord Blackwood's attention. At every gathering, his eyes found hers. Not constantly. That would have been improper, would have drawn Sebastian's notice. But in stolen moments across crowded ballrooms, their gazes would meet and hold, an entire conversation passing in silence. In Charlotte's mind, she pretended it was about the masquerade, despite knowing that was quite silly. Sebastian had noticed Lord Blackwood's presence at various events, but hadn't yet connected it to Charlotte. Gabriel, however, had developed an annoying habit of appearing at her elbow whenever Lord Blackwood seemed likely to approach. "You're being ridiculous," Charlotte told him at the Carrington musicale. "Am I?" Gabriel's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. "Because it seems to me that Lord Blackwood has attended more events in the past month than he has in the past year, and his attention seems remarkably focused. You're imagining things." She knew he wasn't, though. "Charlotte." Gabriel studied her with unusual perception. "I know I don't pay as much attention as Sebastian does, but I can see that Rake is interested, and Sebastian would have an apoplexy." "Which is why," Charlotte said firmly, "there's nothing to tell him." Gabriel looked as if he wanted to argue, then sighed. "Just be careful, please. I don't want to see you hurt." The genuine concern in his voice made Charlotte's chest ache. "I will be. I promise." But that promise became harder to keep with each passing day. The Ashcombe ball arrived on a warm evening in early May. Charlotte attended with reluctance, finding the ballroom stifling and the conversations even more so. After the first hour, she escaped to the garden, seeking cooler air and a moment's reprieve from the crush. The Ashcombe's garden was modest compared to the Thornberrys, but thoughtfully designed with winding paths and strategic plantings that created pockets of privacy. Charlotte followed a path toward a small fountain with nearby lanterns showing the way, grateful for the sound of water and relative quiet. She'd been there only a few minutes when footsteps approached. Charlotte turned to find Lord Blackwood, Alexander, though she only thought of him that way in private, emerging from the shadows. He stopped when he saw her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Miss Halsted," he bowed, perfectly proper. "Forgive the intrusion." "Lord Blackwood." Charlotte's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "There's no intrusion. I was merely seeking air." "As was I." He hesitated, then gestured to the fountain's edge. "May I? Or would you prefer solitude?" Charlotte knew she should send him away, should maintain the careful distance that Sebastian's inevitable disapproval demanded. But sitting beside him at the Thornbury ball had felt so natural, so right, that she found herself nodding. "You may stay." He settled onto the low stone wall, maintaining a respectful distance. For several moments they sat in silence, listening to the water's gentle splash. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said finally, "at the Thornbury ball, about observation and peace." Charlotte's breath caught. "Have you? You surprise me. That you remember it. You said you preferred watching to participating, that there was freedom in observation." He turned to look at her fully. "But sitting here now, I find myself wondering if perhaps there's also loneliness in it." The question was gentle but perceptive. Charlotte considered lying, deflecting, but something about the quiet garden and his honest query made her answer truthfully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but loneliness is safer than disappointment." "Is it?" His voice carried genuine curiosity. "Or is it simply different?" Charlotte found herself smiling despite her unease. "You're very philosophical for a Rake. You're very franker for a shy Wallflower." His answering smile warmed something in her chest. "Though I'm beginning to think Wallflower is a remarkably insufficient description for you, Charlotte Halsted." The use of her Christian name sent heat racing through her. Improper, intimate, everything she shouldn't want, but did. "You don't know me well enough to make that judgment," she pointed out. Don't I? He leaned slightly closer, and Charlotte's pulse quickened. I know you speak honestly when others perform. I know you value genuine conversation over social pleasantries. I know you're observant enough to notice things others miss. He paused, his gaze holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. And I know, he continued quietly, that you're far braver than you pretend to be. Charlotte's heart hammered. There was something in his tone, a weight, that suggested he meant more than general observation. What makes you say that? Her voice came out more breathy than she'd intended. Intuition. His eyes never left hers. Or perhaps experience. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning Charlotte wasn't quite ready to unpack. Before she could formulate a response, he spoke again. May I ask you something? Of course, if I can do the same, she asked. He nodded easily. Why do you let your brother dictate your choices? The question was blunt enough to make Charlotte blink. What? Sebastian. Alexander's voice gentled slightly. From what I understand, he's rather protective. Finds fault with potential suitors. Makes it difficult for anyone to approach you. Charlotte's throat tightened. He means well. I'm sure he does, but that wasn't my question. He tilted his head, studying her. Why do you let him? You're intelligent, capable of making your own judgments, yet you allow his interference. Because they weren't worth fighting for, Charlotte thought. But she couldn't quite make herself say it aloud. Perhaps, she said carefully, his judgment has been sound. The gentlemen he's discouraged haven't been particularly remarkable. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, and if someone remarkable came along, someone worth fighting for, would you still let him dictate your choice? Charlotte's breath caught. The question felt loaded, personal, as if he were asking about himself, about them, about what might be possible if she dared defy Sebastian's judgment. I don't know, she whispered honestly. I've never had reason to find out. You are uniquely lovely, the kind of lovely any gentleman with eyes would seek out. Surely there have been callers that made you think about it. His eyes held hers for a long moment, and Charlotte felt the weight of everything unspoken between them. Not yet, she admitted quietly. His eyes flared, seemingly pleased by her quiet reply. And what question do you have for me? Why are you always watching me? She said, then promptly blushed despite the cool night air. He looked taken aback for a moment, but then his eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he watched her intently. I cannot seem to look away for long. He said simply, then stood offering his hand. We should return, before your brother notices you're missing and sends a search party. Charlotte placed her hand in his and let him help her rise. They stood close for a heartbeat, his hand warm beneath hers, the night air soft around them. Charlotte, he said quietly, I'd very much like the opportunity to know you better, with propriety, with your family's knowledge. May I call on you? Her heart soared and plummeted simultaneously. Sebastian would never. Let me try. His voice carried quiet determination. Let me prove I'm more than my reputation suggests. Let me earn his approval and your trust. Alexander. The name slipped out before Charlotte could stop it, and his eyes widened slightly at the intimacy. You know my given name. Charlotte felt heat bloom in her cheeks. I rather like how you say it. We should return, Charlotte managed, though she made no move toward the ballroom. Yes. But he didn't move either. though I confess I'm in no hurry to return to the performance. Nor I, she admitted. They stood in the quiet garden, neither quite ready to break the moment. Finally, reluctantly, they began walking back toward the terrace, Charlotte's hand resting lightly on his arm. The familiar position felt increasingly natural, as if her hand belonged there. As they neared the ballroom's light and noise, Charlotte felt him tense slightly beside her. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "whatever your brother decides, know that I meant what I said. About wanting to know you. About this being more than a passing interest." Charlotte's throat felt tight. Alexander. But they'd reached the terrace doors, stepping from the garden's privacy into the ballroom's public scrutiny. Charlotte felt the weight of curious eyes immediately, saw her mother's face across the room shift from concern to something approaching distress. And standing near the refreshment table, looking between them with dawning recognition and barely concealed malice, was Lady Catherine Winters. Well, well. Lady Catherine's voice carried across the immediate vicinity as she moved toward them with predatory grace. "You two together again, I see." The words seemed innocuous enough, but Charlotte heard the edge beneath them, saw the calculation in Lady Catherine's eyes as she studied their faces. Alexander had gone very still beside her. Charlotte felt tension radiate through his arm beneath her hand. "Lady Catherine." His voice was perfectly polite, carefully neutral. "Good evening. Does someone require you in the drawing room?" Lady Catherine continued, looking between the two of them, quirking an eyebrow with deliberate emphasis. There was weight in that last word. "Merely taking some air," Charlotte said, trying to keep her voice steady. She watched Alexander's expression shift, confusion giving way to sudden, sharp focus. He looked at Charlotte with new intensity, and she saw the exact moment comprehension crashed over him. "The Masquerade," he repeated slowly, his gaze never leaving Charlotte's face. His eyes widened slightly. "You were... Oh, did I say something I shouldn't?" Lady Catherine's false innocence was razor-sharp. Those words, that specific reference to her fabricated excuse. Lady Catherine was making it clear, without explicitly saying so, that she knew exactly who had interrupted her scheme. Alexander's grip on Charlotte's arm tightened almost imperceptibly. His expression had transformed from confusion to absolute certainty across his features. Charlotte could only watch understanding bloom in his eyes. Recognition, amazement, and something that looked almost like joy. Lady Catherine swept away with a tight smile, leaving them frozen in the ballroom entrance, not realizing what she'd just done. "Charlotte," Alexander said, louder now, his voice carrying barely restrained emotion. "Tell me I'm right. Tell me it was you." People were starting to notice their frozen stance, the intensity with which he looked at her. "Please," Charlotte whispered, "not here, not with everyone watching." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Come with me. I can't, please." His hand covered hers on his arm, warm and solid. "Don't run from me. Not again." The plea in his voice undid her. Charlotte nodded, letting him guide her through the ballroom with purposeful strides, not toward the terrace, but toward a quieter corridor that led to the Ashcombs' library. Alexander was already opening the library door, ushering her inside and closing it behind them with quiet finality. The library was empty, lit only by moonlight streaming through tall windows. Alexander turned to face her, and the expression on his face stole Charlotte's breath. Why didn't you tell me? His voice shook slightly. I searched for you for weeks when you were right there. You weren't searching for me. The words tumbled out, raw and honest. You were searching for someone who saved you. Someone bold and brave. That woman in the mask. That was a moment of courage, not who I am. I'm just Charlotte Halsted, Sebastian's sister, the Wallflower who... Stop. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, and Charlotte's words died. Don't diminish what you did. Don't pretend you're not exactly who I've been looking for. You don't understand? Then help me understand. His hands came up as if to touch her face, then dropped as if he didn't trust himself. Tell me why you hid, why you ran away. Charlotte's throat felt tight with unshed tears, because I knew. Once you realized who I was, Sebastian's younger sister, you'd be disappointed. The woman at the Masquerade was bold because of anonymity. Charlotte Halsted is just reserved, not particularly remarkable. Not remarkable? His voice carried something between frustration and wonder. Charlotte, you risked scandal to save a stranger. You lied with perfect conviction. You saw a trap closing and stepped forward when everyone else looked away. How is that not remarkable? That was one moment. It wasn't just one moment. His fingers finally touched her face, gentle against her cheek. It was every conversation we've had since. Your honesty, your observations, the way you see through social performance to something real. That's not the mask, Charlotte. That's you. I'm interested in you, whether I knew you were who I needed to thank or not. But at the Masquerade, I felt brave. You are brave. His thumb traced her cheekbone. The mask didn't create courage. It just gave you permission to show what was already there. Charlotte shook her head, but he continued, his voice dropping lower. The feeling you gave me in that corridor, the sense of being truly seen. Not as Lord Blackwood the Rake, not as a reputation or a scandal or a performance. Just me, Alexander, a person. His other hand came up to frame her face, and Charlotte felt her breath stutter. Every woman I spoke to, he continued, I was looking for that connection, that honesty, that moment where the performance dropped and something real existed between us. And I couldn't find it. It was never just about a mysterious rescue. His forehead nearly touched hers now, his breath warm against her lips. It was about you, the way you spoke to me in that corridor as if I were worth saving. The way you talked about observation and peace at the Thornbury ball, letting me see something genuine. The way you are right now, trying so hard to convince me you're ordinary when you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. I'm clearly just now melding the woman I'm grateful to with the woman I'm intrigued by. Alexander, Charlotte whispered, his name a plea and a surrender. There's more, he said quietly. Something I haven't told you about why I've been so determined to find you. Charlotte waited, her heart racing. My sister was about to make her debut. She had an understanding with a good man, perfect for her, everything she'd hoped for. His jaw tightened, but if Lady Catherine had succeeded that night, if I'd been compromised, the scandal would have destroyed everything. My sister's engagement would have been called off, her reputation ruined by association with her Rake brother. And I couldn't bear that prospect. Understanding crashed over Charlotte. Oh, that's what I saved. He nodded as his eyes held hers, intense and honest. You saved her future, her happiness, everything that mattered. How could I not try to find you? To know what kind of woman does that? To understand how someone could be so selfless, so brave, so... He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. You saved more than me, Charlotte. You saved what I love most in the world, and you disappeared before I could even properly thank you. Tears burned Charlotte's eyes. I didn't know. I just saw someone in trouble and I couldn't watch it happen. Exactly. His voice was fierce now. Absolute. You couldn't watch it happen. You stepped forward, expecting nothing, risking scandal at your own family's ball, because it was right. That's who you are. Not the woman who hides in corners, though you do that. Not the sister who lets Sebastian dictate her choices, though you've done that too. You're the woman who acts when others freeze, who saves strangers because someone should. Who's brave enough to stand in a darkened corridor with a rake and tell him the truth? I'm not. You are. He cut her off gently. And I've spent weeks trying to find you so I could tell you that. Not some perfect, mysterious woman. Just you. Charlotte Halsted. Sebastian will never approve. Then I'll earn his approval. Alexander's voice carried absolute determination. He'll make it impossible. Good. His slight smile made her chest ache. Nothing worth having comes easily. If I have to fight your impossible brother, if I have to prove myself 100 times over, if I have to wait months for permission to court you properly, Charlotte, I'll do it. This is worth it. You barely know me, Charlotte whispered, though her treacherous heart soared at his words. Then let me know you better. His hand still framed her face, gentle and sure. Let me call on you. Let me face Sebastian's scrutiny. Let me prove this isn't about the masquerade or the mystery, or anything except you. Charlotte stared at him, her heart racing, every rational thought screaming that this was impossible. Sebastian would forbid it. Her mother would worry. The ton would gossip endlessly. But looking into Alexander's eyes, seeing genuine feeling, real determination, the promise of being truly known and valued, Charlotte found that none of those obstacles mattered as much as the simple truth staring back at her. Yes, she breathed. His smile was incandescent. Yes? Yes. She reached up to touch his face, marveling at her own courage. Charlotte, The library door opened. They sprang apart, but not quickly enough. Gabriel stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something approaching concern. Charlotte. Her brother's voice was carefully controlled. Mother is looking for you, and Sebastian is asking where you've gone. Charlotte's stomach dropped. Gabriel, Lord Blackwood. Gabriel's attention shifted to Alexander, and Charlotte saw her brother assess the situation with uncomfortable accuracy. The tears on her cheeks, their proximity, the intimacy of the moment he'd interrupted. My sister has been absent for quite some time. It was both an acknowledgement and a warning. Mr. Halsted. Alexander's voice was steady despite the tension in his posture. I was just... Yes, I'm sure. Gabriel's tone was dry, but not unkind. Charlotte, you need to return to the ballroom. Now, before Sebastian comes looking himself. Charlotte's chest tightened with dread. Has he noticed? Does he know that you've been missing? Yes. that you've been with Lord Blackwood. Gabriel glanced between them. Not yet, but he will if you don't return immediately. It was a kindness and a warning. Charlotte moved toward the door, pausing only when Alexander caught her hand. I meant every word, he murmured, too quietly for Gabriel to hear clearly. Then he released her, and Charlotte had no choice but to follow her brother back toward the ballroom, her heart still racing, her face still damp with tears, her mind replaying everything Alexander had said. You're exactly what I've been looking for. As they walked, Gabriel spoke quietly. Charlotte, I won't tell Sebastian, but you need to be more careful. If anyone else had found you. I know. Charlotte's voice shook slightly. Gabriel, you care about him. It wasn't a question. Actually care. Not just passing interest. Charlotte couldn't deny it. Yes. Gabriel sighed, but his expression held understanding rather than judgment. Then prepare yourself, because Sebastian is going to fight this, and it's going to be difficult. I know. But Charlotte? Gabriel glanced at her with something that might have been approval. I've never seen you willing to fight before, not like this. So maybe this one is actually worth it. They reached the ballroom entrance. Charlotte took a steadying breath, wiped her eyes, and stepped back into the bright lights and curious gazes. Her mother descended immediately, concern and relief warring on her face. Charlotte, where have you been? I have been worried. I just needed some air, Mama. I'm sorry. Later, across the ballroom, Charlotte caught Alexander's gaze. He stood near the terrace doors, but his attention was entirely on her. No more searching, no more wondering. He'd found her, and she'd let herself be found. Sebastian stood with Lord Pemberton near the windows, his back to her. He hadn't noticed yet, but he would. And when he did, Charlotte would face whatever came. Because for the first time in her life, she'd found someone remarkable. Someone worth defying her brother's judgment for. Someone who saw her, truly saw her, and found her extraordinary. Standing in that library, Alexander had offered her everything she'd been too cautious to hope for. Genuine connection, real understanding, the promise of being known and valued for who she actually was. And Charlotte, who had spent years preferring observation to participation, found she was finally ready to step forward, ready to be brave, ready to fight for what she wanted. The season was only beginning, and Sebastian's opposition would be fierce. But meeting Alexander's gaze across the crowded ballroom, seeing the promise in his eyes and the determination in his expression, Charlotte felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Alexander Blackwood called on the Halsted family 2 days after the Ashcombe ball. Charlotte heard the commotion from the drawing room, the butler's formal tones, her brother's surprised greeting, and then his voice, sharp with displeasure. Absolutely not. Charlotte set down her embroidery and stood, her heart racing. She'd known this moment would come, had spent 2 days preparing herself for it. My sister is not... Sebastian's voice carried through the half-open study door. Charlotte didn't let him finish. She walked straight to the study, pushed open the door without knocking, and stepped inside. 2 faces turned toward her with varying degrees of surprise. Alexander looked relieved, and Sebastian looked shocked. Charlotte never interrupted, never entered rooms without permission, never inserted herself into conversations that didn't concern her. "Charlotte?" Sebastian began, his tone suggesting she should leave immediately. "No." The single word came out stronger than she'd intended. "This concerns me, Sebastian. I'm staying." Her brother's eyebrows rose. "Charlotte, this is not—" "I said no." Charlotte moved further into the room, her pulse racing but her voice steady. "Lord Blackwood has come to request permission to court me. That gives me the right to be present for this conversation." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly." Charlotte turned to face her brother fully, and something in her expression must have conveyed her determination, because Sebastian actually paused. "Charlotte," her voice didn't waver, "I want the chance to know him, with propriety, with your supervision, if you insist." The study fell silent. Sebastian stared at his younger sister as if he'd never seen her before. Perhaps he hadn't. Not like this. Not standing tall and certain, fighting for something she wanted rather than quietly accepting his protection. Her mama had been hovering behind her and cleared her throat. "Sebastian, perhaps we should hear what Lord Blackwood has to say." "Mama, your sister has never spoken to you this way." Her voice was gentle but firm. "That alone suggests this is different." Sebastian turned to Charlotte, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not immediate approval, but recognition. Understanding that something fundamental had changed. "This is highly irregular," he said quietly. "I know." Charlotte's throat felt tight. She glanced at Alexander, then back at her brother. Sebastian looked between them, his determined sister, and the notorious Rake who'd somehow inspired this unprecedented defiance. His expression was complicated, layered with protective instinct and grudging respect. "Lord Blackwood." Sebastian's voice was controlled but not entirely hostile. "You have a reputation." "I do." Alexander stepped forward, his voice steady. "One I've earned through years of carelessness and poor judgment. I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise." "Then why should I permit you anywhere near my sister?" "Because she saved me." The words were simple, honest. "Not just from Lady Catherine's scheme at your masquerade. She saved me from myself. She made me want to be more than my reputation suggests." Both Sebastian and their mother immediately turned to Charlotte questioningly. "Lady Catherine was coordinating a compromise scheme at our annual event. I noticed there was no time but to act. So I did." Her mother and Sebastian looked at each other in shock, then back at Charlotte. "I'll explain more later," she assured them. Sebastian's expression didn't soften, but he didn't immediately refuse either. "Your sister is remarkable," Alexander continued, "intelligent, observant, honest in a way most people aren't capable of. And I absolutely know that I don't deserve her. But I'd like the chance to try to become someone who does." "Pretty words," Sebastian said, but without the dismissive edge Charlotte had expected. "Honest words." Alexander met Sebastian's gaze directly. "I'm not asking for your blessing to marry her tomorrow. I'm asking for permission to court her properly, with whatever supervision and restrictions you and her mama deem appropriate. Give me the chance to prove I'm more than my reputation. And if I fail, if I prove you right, then I'll accept your judgment and leave her alone." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Charlotte. "You truly want this?" "I do." Charlotte's voice was absolute. Sebastian studied her face, and Charlotte saw the exact moment he truly understood. His youngest sister, shy, reserved Charlotte, who'd spent years accepting his protective judgment, was finally fighting for something. Someone. Very well. Sebastian's voice carried resignation and something that might have been respect. But with conditions. Charlotte's heart soared, even as Sebastian continued. Informal courtship only. No formal engagement without my explicit approval, which you have not earned, Lord Blackwood. You may call on her, always with family present. You may dance with Charlotte at social gatherings, no more than 2 dances per event. You may walk with her in public parks, with her maid present. Any breach of these rules, any hint of impropriety, and this arrangement ends immediately. Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes even as she nodded. "I understand," Alexander said as he looked between Sebastian, her mamma, and Charlotte, "and I accept the conditions completely." After Alexander left, Sebastian lingered in the study with Charlotte. "I've never seen you like that," he said quietly, fighting, insisting, standing your ground. "I've never had reason to before." "And the others? Carrington, Ashford, Pemberton? Weren't worth the battle." Charlotte met her brother's eyes. "And I needed you to understand that." Sebastian studied her for a long moment. "You really care about him." "I do." "Then I hope," Sebastian said, his voice carrying genuine concern beneath the sternness, "that he proves worthy of it. Because, Charlotte, if he hurts you, there isn't a corner of England where he'll be safe from me." Charlotte smiled despite herself. "I know." Over the following month, Alexander courted Charlotte according to Sebastian's exacting rules, and it was everything Charlotte had hoped for. He called at the Halsted residence twice weekly, always punctual, always impeccably proper. They sat in the drawing room with Charlotte's mother present, talking about books and music and philosophy. But more than that, they talked about real things, fears and hopes, and the observations about society that neither shared with anyone else. At the Pemberton ball, he claimed his permitted 2 dances, a quadrille that left them laughing at a shared observation about Lady Winters's obvious machinations, and a waltz that made Charlotte's heart race with the simple joy of being held by someone who truly saw her. At Lady Thornbury's garden party, they walked the grounds with Charlotte's maid, trailing discreetly behind. Alexander pointed out a bird's nest tucked in a rose arbor, and they spent 10 minutes discussing both silly and serious things, finding they had far more in common than she ever expected. It was sometimes mundane and perfect, and everything Charlotte had never known she wanted. "You're different from what I expected," Charlotte said as they paused by a fountain. "How so?" "Gentler, more thoughtful, less," she searched for the word, "less rakish." Alexander's smile was rueful. "That's because the rake was always a kind of armor. This," he gestured between them, "this is real. With you, being myself is easier, and so much more." He laced his fingers through hers, the intimacy saying more than words. She'd never felt so happy. Each encounter deepened their connection. Alexander was revealing himself in ways Charlotte suspected he rarely did, admitting uncertainties, sharing childhood memories, speaking about his sister with such tenderness that Charlotte's chest ached. And Charlotte found herself doing the same, sharing observations she'd kept private, admitting fears about never finding a genuine connection, speaking honestly about Sebastian's protectiveness and her own complicity in accepting his judgment for so long. They were slowly building something authentic while also learning more about what was important to each of them. Alexander mentioned his sister during one of his recent visits. "Amelia has been asking to have you over for tea," he said, and something in his voice suggested this was significant. "She's heard me speak of you constantly, and she's curious." Charlotte's pulse quickened. I'd be honored to meet her. Relief flooded Alexander's expression. "She means everything to me. Her opinion matters more than anyone's." "Then of course I want to meet her. When?" They arranged it for the following Tuesday. Tea at the Blackwood residence, with Charlotte's mother accompanying as chaperone. Charlotte dressed with particular care that afternoon, understanding instinctively that this meeting mattered. Amelia's approval would mean something to Alexander, perhaps everything. The Blackwood townhouse was elegant but warm, lived in rather than showpiece. Alexander greeted them at the door himself, his smile genuine and slightly nervous. "Thank you for coming. Amelia has been counting the minutes." He led them to a sun-filled drawing room where a young woman waited. Amelia Blackwood was lovely. Dark hair like her brother's, warm brown eyes, an expression of such open enthusiasm that Charlotte felt immediately at ease. Amelia greeted both her and her mother, her delight unfeigned, her excitement contagious. "I'm so pleased to finally meet you. Alexander has spoken of nothing but you for weeks." "Amelia." Alexander's voice carried warning, but his sister ignored it with obvious affection. "It's true. You've quite transformed him. He's actually pleasant to be around now. Before, he was always so—" She waved a hand expressively. "Distant, performing. But with you, he's genuine. It's remarkable." Charlotte felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Your brother is very easy to speak with, honestly." "That," Amelia said with emphasis, "is the first time anyone has ever said that about him. Usually they say charming, witty, or dangerously attractive. But honest? That's entirely new." Tea proceeded with easy conversation. Amelia was delightful, warm, genuine, asking Charlotte about her interests and family with curiosity. Charlotte found herself relaxing completely, enjoying the obvious affection between brother and sister, and the way Amelia's presence brought out an even softer side of Alexander. Alexander had stepped away briefly, and Amelia turned to her. "I must tell you," Amelia said as they finished their tea, reaching across to squeeze Charlotte's hand, "how grateful I am for what you did at your family's masquerade." Charlotte's breath caught. "Alexander told you?" "Of course, and we tell each other everything." Amelia's eyes shone with genuine emotion. "You saved my future that night, my engagement, my happiness, everything. I can never thank you enough." "I only did what anyone would." "No." Amelia's voice was gentle but firm. "You did what no one else did. You saw someone in trouble, and you acted despite the risk to yourself. That takes remarkable courage." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in Amelia's voice. "But beyond that," Amelia continued, "you've given me back my brother, the real Alexander, not the man he was pretending to be. I'd given up hope of ever seeing him genuinely happy. After our parents passed, I watched him close in on himself, but also assume this personality that I now think of as armor. And now, she stopped, her expression glowing with joy and unshed tears. Well, you've made him open up again, unlike I've seen in the years since we lost our parents. Alexander rejoined them as Amelia was expressing her gratitude. He approached Amelia and lightly touched her shoulder, smiling gently down at her. Amelia's hand swiftly reached for his arm and touched him lightly in response. Charlotte glanced at Alexander, found him watching her with such open affection that her heart stuttered as he seated himself beside her. I feel the same, Charlotte admitted quietly. He's made me braver, more myself. Perfect. Amelia clapped her hands together. Then I suppose we should start planning. A spring wedding would be lovely, don't you think? Though I suppose we should wait for a proper engagement first, but still, spring seems perfect for new beginnings. What do you think, Charlotte? Early May? Late April? The words were enthusiastic, affectionate, and entirely innocent. But Charlotte felt Alexander go rigid beside her, and watched as his hands flexed and released upon hearing his sister's enthusiasm. He felt a tightness in his throat. The idea itself did not overwhelm him. What unsettled him was how quickly it seemed to gather momentum, how little space there was between what he felt in private and what was now being spoken aloud. With Charlotte, he had learned a careful ease, a way of being unguarded without spectacle. The thought of carrying that version of himself into the open all at once left him unsteady, nervous. Old habits wanted to rush in to restore balance. He could feel it happening in real time. Wit, distance, motion, all within hand's reach. Anything that would slow what was suddenly moving too fast. He looked at Charlotte, sensing her concern over him, and feeling her warmth and the comfort that came from just being near her. So lovely, so real. For a fleeting, unguarded moment, something warm and unsteady rose in him, an impulse to step forward, to claim what was being so easily imagined. But it vanished almost at once, again consumed by a feeling that was suddenly being asked to outrun him. The old instinct answered before thought could follow. If he could not enter a future prepared, and honestly, could he enter it at all? He felt himself sliding back into a familiar shape, one he had perfected over the years and trusted too well, one that had always kept him safe. She glanced at him again and saw that his expression had shuttered, but not before a look of fear shone through, as the warmth drained away, replaced by something careful and distant. We should let Miss Halsted and her mother depart. Alexander's voice had shifted to something carefully polite, formal. Thank you for coming. The change in his demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Charlotte felt it like a chill wind. The genuine connection they'd been building suddenly replaced by the politeness of a charming stranger. Amelia looked stricken, clearly realizing she'd said something wrong. In the carriage ride home, Charlotte's mother chattered about what a lovely girl Amelia was, how well the visit had gone, and how pleased she was with Alexander's courtship. Charlotte barely heard her. She was too focused on that moment when Alexander's expression had closed, when Amelia's innocent enthusiasm about spring weddings had made him retreat into careful formality. He'd panicked. She'd seen it clearly, and it terrified her. The next day, Alexander failed to appear for his scheduled call. Instead, he sent a note, perfectly polite, full of apologies about unexpected business requiring his attention. But Charlotte knew. She recognized retreat when she saw it. At the Ashford ball 3 days later, he appeared, but something fundamental had changed. To everyone else, nothing was amiss. His conversation was pleasant but surface level, lacking the genuine depth that had characterized their usual interactions. "Is everything all right?" Charlotte asked during their waltz, her chest tight with apprehension. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" His smile was practiced, charming, the performance rather than Alexander's genuine warmth. "You seem distant. Just preoccupied with some business matters. Nothing to concern yourself with." But it was a lie. Charlotte could see it in the careful way he held himself, in how his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers, in the return of that polished charm that she'd thought he'd left behind. He was retreating, and she didn't know how to stop it. At his next scheduled call, he arrived with an enormous bouquet of roses, expensive, extravagant, far more elaborate than necessary. "For you," he said, presenting them with a flourish. Charlotte stared at the roses, her throat tight. "They're lovely. But Alexander, you don't need—" "Nonsense. A lady deserves flowers from her suitor." His tone was light, charming, and absolutely wrong. Her mother exclaimed over the bouquet, but Charlotte barely heard her. She was too focused on Alexander's face, on the careful distance in his expression, the return of performance rather than authenticity. He stayed for the required half hour, his conversation witty and entertaining. But it was all surface, all performance. The genuine man she'd been falling in love with had disappeared behind the practiced charm. After he left, Charlotte sat alone in the drawing room, staring at the extravagant roses and feeling something crack in her chest. He was running, and she had no idea how to reach him when he was hiding behind his old walls. At the Pemberton ball, he presented her with an expensive bracelet, far too extravagant for their informal courtship. Charlotte accepted it politely, her heart sinking at the impersonal gesture. "You shouldn't have," she said quietly. "I wanted to." His smile was charming, practiced. "You deserve beautiful things." But Charlotte didn't want beautiful things. She wanted the man who'd spoken honestly about his fears, who'd shared childhood memories, who'd looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person in the world, not this stranger offering expensive gifts as if they could replace a genuine connection. At Lady Thornbury's garden party, he arrived with a rare book he claimed she'd mentioned wanting. Charlotte hadn't mentioned any such thing. He was guessing, performing, trying to impress rather than truly knowing her. "Thank you," she said, accepting the book with dull politeness. She felt lost then. She thrust the book back into his hands. "Please stop." He blinked, caught. For a moment, genuine emotion flickered across his face. Shame, perhaps, or regret. But then the performance snapped back into place and his eyes skidded away. "I thought you might enjoy it." Charlotte looked at him, really looked, and saw the wall he'd erected between them, the careful distance, the retreat into rakish charm. And she realized with painful clarity that she couldn't fight this for him. She'd fought Sebastian for the chance to know Alexander, had stood up for what she wanted for the first time in her life. But she couldn't fight Alexander's fear, couldn't make him want this enough to face genuine feelings. "Alexander," she said quietly, "you don't need to do this." "Do what?" Her chest ached, and her voice broke despite her valiant attempt to keep it steady. "I don't even know what to call it. You appear to be going through the motions to keep me, but to keep me at arm's length at the very same time. I miss you. The real you. The one who spoke honestly. The one who admitted fears during our calls. The one who looked at me as if I mattered. Something flickered in his eyes, pain perhaps, or longing, but the performance held. I'm simply trying to be a proper suitor. Charlotte felt something inside her give up. No, she said softly, you're not. And I understand to some extent, I do. But Alexander, I can't do this. You're here with me, but you're not truly present. I can't reach you, and I can't fight for us, alone. She turned and walked away before he could respond, her throat tight with unshed tears. He watched her as she rejoined her family, composed, still, elegant. He remained where he was. After the garden party, Charlotte stopped accepting Alexander's notes and gifts. The flowers he sent were returned with polite notes. The jewellery remained in its box, delivered back to him through his footman. The invitations to special outings were ignored and calls refused. At social gatherings, Charlotte was unfailingly polite, but distant. She no longer sought him out with her eyes across ballrooms. She no longer stood in positions where he could easily approach. She no longer engaged with his attempts at conversation beyond surface pleasantries. She withdrew, completely. Not with anger or drama, but with quiet, devastating finality. As if she'd decided he simply wasn't worth the effort of trying anymore. Margaret noticed first. Charlotte, what happened? Lord Blackwood looks absolutely lost, and you won't even look at him properly. Nothing happened. Charlotte's voice was flat. We simply realized we weren't well suited after all. But you fought for him. You challenged Sebastian. I know what I did. Charlotte's composure cracked slightly. At the Carstairs ball, Alexander watched Charlotte dance with Lord Ashford and other suitors, and it was killing him. She looked beautiful, composed, completely unreachable. He'd tried everything, flowers, gifts, witty conversation. All the tools in his arsenal had always worked before with other women. But not with Charlotte. She'd simply ignored him, retreated into polite distance that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. You're staring. Gabriel Halsted appeared at his elbow, his voice neutral. Again. Alexander forced himself to look away. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Gabriel studied him with uncomfortable perception. You'd actually won her over. She fought our brother for you. Do you have any idea how unprecedented that was? The words landed like blows. I'm trying to fix it. No, you're not. Gabriel's voice was matter-of-fact, almost kind. You're trying to impress her, charm her, win her back with grand gestures and expensive gifts. But Charlotte has received that kind of attention for years, and has no interest in it. You let her slip away, and I don't believe you even know what you lost. Alexander's chest felt tight. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Gabriel's expression was surprisingly sympathetic. You panicked. It happens. But Lord Blackwood, I say this for Charlotte's sake more than yours. You're running out of time. Gabriel walked away, leaving Alexander standing alone in the ballroom, his words echoing in the silence. A week after the garden party, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the same page of correspondence he'd been pretending to read for the past hour. He'd never felt this lost. This genuinely, devastatingly lost. You're brooding. He looked up to find Amelia standing in his doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. I'm working. You're staring at nothing and looking miserable. She entered without invitation, settling in the chair across from his desk. We need to talk about Charlotte. Alexander's chest tightened. There's nothing to talk about. Isn't there? Amelia leaned forward, her voice gentle. Alexander, what happened? You'd been happier than I've seen you in years. Now you look like someone died. Nothing happened. Don't lie to me. Amelia's tone was firm. Something changed, and I think it was me. What I said about spring weddings. Alexander said nothing, which was answer enough. Oh, understanding dawned in Amelia's eyes. I scared you. You didn't, he started. I absolutely did. She studied his face with uncomfortable perception. He ran his hands over his eyes in defeat. I felt this overwhelming fear of the speed of needing to be everything at once, of letting go of what had taken years to build. I have no doubts about my feelings for Charlotte. But when you said spring, what if I'm not ready or capable of being who she needs so soon? Of being enough? But you already are who she needs. She seems strong enough to weather whatever storms might come your way, as you continue to shed the rest. Amelia's voice was fierce now. What if the only thing stopping you from having everything you want is your own fear? Amelia stood, moving around the desk to face him directly. You're terrified. So you've done what you learned to do. Retreat behind a persona that you and I know isn't real. You've proved everyone right about you. And you're better than that. Alexander looked away, unable to meet his sister's eyes. But here's what you're missing. Amelia continued, her voice softening. Charlotte already knows you. The real you. Do you think she wouldn't understand how new all of this is to you? Amelia. She fought for you, Alexander, for you, because she believed you were worth fighting for. The words landed like stones in Alexander's chest. And if that's not enough, then at least you'll know you tried. I miss my brother. I had him back for a short time, and I want him back again. I think you do too. Alexander looked at her with a tender smile. All this time, I thought I needed to be strong for you. But you've been strong enough for both of us the whole time. His eyes shone with pride. Amelia's eyes welled over, and she reached out to hug him swiftly before leaving. I've faith in you, dear brother, she called out over her shoulder as she crossed the threshold. Alexander sat in the silence of his study, her words echoing in his mind. The truth of it sat heavily in his chest. Charlotte had withdrawn, had stopped engaging with his attempts to keep and fix things through gifts and charm, had given up on him. He thought of her face at the Thornbury garden party, the quiet devastation when she'd said, I can't fight for us alone. She'd been right. Instead, he'd hidden behind expensive gifts and practiced charm, had tried to perform his way back to her affection. He thought of her honesty, her ability to cut through social pretense to a genuine connection. The way she'd looked at him in that corridor at the Masquerade as a person worth saving rather than a reputation to avoid. He'd fallen in love with her authenticity. And then, when she'd asked for his in return, he'd retreated behind masks. Alexander stood abruptly. He had to see her, had to talk to her, even if she refused him, even if he'd hurt her too badly to be forgiven. At least she would know the truth. Alexander stood in his study and faced the truth he'd been avoiding. He'd lost her, not to Sebastian's opposition or society's gossip or any external obstacle. He'd lost her because when things became real, genuinely, terrifyingly real, he'd proven himself unworthy. But he couldn't lose her, wouldn't lose her. He realized the fear of that was greater than the fear of not being ready to lower all of his walls. But to win her back, if such a thing was even possible, he'd need to be genuinely, wholly, vulnerably honest, even if it destroyed him, even if she refused him anyway, even if it meant risking heartbreak deeper than any he'd ever experienced. The Thornbury musical was that evening. Charlotte would be there. She attended everything now with quiet determination. He'd watched her at recent events, refusing to stand in her customary corners, braving the perfunctory conversations she'd avoided before. His chest ached. Alexander had dressed with unusual care. The Thornbury townhouse was crowded when he arrived. He immediately scanned the room methodically, his pulse racing. There, Charlotte stood near the windows, a cup of tea in her hand, her expression carefully neutral, as she listened to Lady Pemberton. Alexander started toward her, then stopped as Gabriel Halsted materialized from the crowd, positioning himself deliberately in Alexander's path. Lord Blackwood. Gabriel's voice was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. A word? Alexander's stomach dropped, but he nodded. Of course. Gabriel guided him toward a quieter corner, away from curious ears. His expression was unreadable. I'm going to give you some advice, Gabriel said quietly. Whether you take it is your choice, but I think you need to hear it. Alexander waited, tension coiling in his shoulders. My sister has been miserable for weeks, Gabriel continued, politely, quietly miserable in a way that's somehow worse than if she were angry. She won't talk about it, won't complain. She just withdraws further every day. The words were knives in Alexander's chest. Leave her be. I cannot. Alexander met Gabriel's eyes, saw understanding rather than judgment there. Gabriel paused, studying Alexander's face, seeing the determined light in his eyes. I see. Gabriel stepped aside, wary but watchful, wondering if Alexander would muck it up as he had in days past. Alexander took a deep breath and started toward Charlotte. This time, he didn't stop. She saw him approaching and something flickered across her face, wariness perhaps, or resignation. She set down her teacup with careful precision. Miss Halsted, he bowed, heart racing. May I have a moment of your time? I'm not certain that's wise, Lord Blackwood. Please. The single word came out rawer than he'd intended. Something shifted in Charlotte's expression. Not softening exactly, but a slight easing of her careful guard. Very well, she said quietly, though I'm not certain what there is left to say. Everything. Alexander's voice was low, intense. There's everything left to say, but not here, not with everyone watching. May I? He hesitated. May I walk you in the garden? With a chaperone present, of course. Charlotte studied his face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her because she nodded slowly. 5 minutes. That's all. Thank you. They walked to the garden in silence. The Thornbury garden was extensive, paths winding through flowering shrubs and carefully tended beds. Lanterns cast gentle light across the gravel paths. Alexander guided them toward a bench beneath a rose arbor, the same place they'd had one of their most honest conversations during courtship. Charlotte noticed. He could tell by the slight tightening of her expression. You have 5 minutes, Charlotte said quietly, trying desperately to maintain her composure, to not feel or grieve, and to squash the seedling of hope that started to bloom when she looked at the longing in his eyes. She looked away, settling on the bench, but maintaining careful distance. What do you wish to say, Alexander? Alexander sat on the far end of the bench, his hands clasped tightly together. This was it. The moment to be genuinely honest or lose her forever. "I'm terrified," he said simply. Charlotte blinked, clearly not expecting that opening. "Of you, of us, of everything." The words came easier once he started, as if honesty had its own momentum. When Amelia mentioned spring weddings, when she talked about permanent futures, I panicked, completely and thoroughly panicked, afraid that I couldn't dismantle, shed the walls that had taken years to erect, in time, if ever, afraid of letting you down. Charlotte said nothing, but she was listening, really listening, sitting in the silence. "Why would you think that?" Charlotte's voice was quiet, but her eyes were direct. "Because being with you meant being real," he said quietly. "And I had only just learned how to do that without hiding. I panicked, not because I didn't want a future with you, but because I didn't know how to carry that version of myself everywhere at once. So soon. So I did what I've always done when I'm afraid. I performed. That frightened you," Charlotte said, her voice carrying understanding despite her guarded expression. "It terrified me." Alexander's hands tightened in his lap. When things began moving faster than I knew how to hold, I retreated. Behind charm and gifts and grand gestures, Charlotte said quietly, "Yes." The admission felt like a confession. I thought if I could just impress you enough, charm you enough, give you expensive enough gifts, you'd forget that I'd panicked, that I wouldn't lose you. I never wanted any of that. I wanted you. I know. Alexander's throat felt tight. "I know that now. Gabriel told me, Amelia told me, but mostly I know it because I lost you, because you were done fighting for someone who wouldn't fight alongside you." Tears shone in Charlotte's eyes. Alexander shifted slightly closer, "And that's why I'm here, with just truth." He took a breath, gathering every ounce of courage he possessed. "I love you, Charlotte Halsted. Completely, devastatingly, terrifyingly. Love you. And although I'm still frightened by the speed of needing to put myself into the open, all at once, in time for a spring wedding, I'm more frightened of losing you completely." His voice shook, but he pressed on. "I know I hurt you by retreating. I know expensive gifts and practiced charm can't undo that. But I'm here now, being as honest as I know how to be, asking, no, begging for one more chance. I never asked for a spring wedding." Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. "I know that. It was never you. It was my unrealistic belief that I needed to be whole, perfect, and the speed required to dismantle what had taken years to build. I always wanted you, always loved you, but after I'd withdrawn again, I'd no idea how to express it." He finally let himself reach for her hand, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. "I'm asking for the chance to fight for us the way you did." Tears spilled down Charlotte's cheeks now. "You hurt me." "I know." The words were agonized. "And I will regret it for the rest of my life. I'm not asking you to forget that it happened. How do I know you won't retreat again?" Charlotte's voice broke. "The next time something frightens you." Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "I can't promise I won't be frightened. Can't promise vulnerability will ever come easily to me. But I can promise that I'll stay. That I'll be honest even when it's difficult. That I'll stop hiding and let you see me. All of me. Uncertain and flawed and terrified. But genuine." He brought her hand to his chest, pressed it against his racing heart. I love you, he said again, the words raw and honest. I love your honesty, your courage, the way you see through everyone's masks, the way you make me want to be better than my reputation suggests. I love you, Charlotte, and I'm begging for the chance to show you. Charlotte stared at him, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed against his heart where she could feel its racing rhythm. No more grand gestures, she whispered. No more grand gestures, just honesty. No more retreating when things become frightening. I'll stay, even when I'm terrified, especially when I'm terrified. Just me, the real me, however flawed and uncertain that might be. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, searching his face. Alexander let her look, let her see everything he usually kept hidden. The fear, the vulnerability, the desperate hope that she might give him another chance. I'm still hurt, Charlotte said finally. I know, and I'm still frightened you'll retreat again. I know. He held her gaze. All I can promise is that I'll stay, to tell you when I'm afraid. That, more than anything, seemed to settle her. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. One more chance, she said. But I won't do this again. I understand. They sat in the garden for several more minutes, foreheads touching, hands clasped, breathing together in the quiet darkness. Around them the musical continued, but for this moment there was only the two of them and the fragile, precious second chance they were building. We should return, Charlotte said finally, though she made no move to stand. Must we? Yes. But Charlotte stayed. He stayed. The end.